With the new Porsche 911 GT3 on the horizon, that got us wondering. Over the years, what have been the best cars to carry those three famous numbers? Sure, each generation has a pinnacle model, the one that is meant to be better than the others. A GT3 or a GT2 RS or similar. But just because they are the most potent ones in Porsche's eyes, that doesn't mean that they're the ones that we think were the very best. Now, we're sure you'll have opinions about this, but we've tried to stay as broad as we can with our selections, and not just get totally focused on speed and power. We're going to go down these in chronological order, so of course we begin with the beginning. Porsche's first sports car hit the world, badged as 901 in 1964. The name was nixed by a very grumpy Peugeot quite early on, and an extra 1 was slotted into the middle. The 911 was born. To some, this was just a Beetle coupe, but we all know that they are both wrong and people that we only associate with to humour them. A 2+2 styled by Ferdinand Porsche, it had a fair amount of 356 about it, and about 130 horsepower from a 2-litre flat 6 slung out the back. The initial 911, which some like to refer to as the classic 911, went through several revisions, before in 1967 our favourite came along. The first car to wear the name Porsche 911R. On the outside, it was pretty inconspicuous, but underneath, it could well have been the most radical 911 that had yet arrived. It was certainly the lightest and probably the most potent. Stripped down, this new 911 was a featherweight, and its 2-litre flat 6 was now wound all the way up to 213 horsepower. The 911R had glass fibre bumpers, bonnet, wings and doors, and every window was plexiglass except for the windscreen, which used the thinnest glass available. And that wasn't all that changed in search of perfection. The 911 waved goodbye to 2 of its normal 5 instruments and its sun visors. The ashtray went too, and that was pretty useless anyway, as Porsche had taken away the cigarette lighter. A year earlier, the 911S had weighed in at an astonishing 1,030 kilograms, but the R made that look lardy by tipping the scales at just 800. It then outstripped its siblings by hitting 62 miles an hour in 5.9 seconds and lapping Hockenheim within 12 seconds of a 906 Group 4 racer. Only 19 911Rs were ever built, making it also one of the rarest and more sought-after cars Porsche has ever made. Before we move on, we'd just like to remind you that if you do enjoy this video, please don't forget to give it a like. It really does help us out, and subscribe to the channel so you can see everything we do here at Goodwood Road and Racing. Never mind air-cooled, until 1975 all Porsche 911s were also fed by just the air that washed into their intakes. All that was about to change with the arrival of the G-Series 911 and a complete overhaul for the model. Codenamed 930 internally, there was a new king arriving in town to top the G-Series line, the 911 Turbo. Back then, when Porsche named its cars, it was very plain about how it went about it. No calling an electric vehicle turbo here. The Turbo was, quite simply, the first car to be force-fed its air. But not just that. The 930 had massive flared rear arches, making it a full 12 centimetres wider. So not only was the 911 now able to boast 260 horsepower, but it looked the part too, with a giant whale tail spoiler just topping the whole smoke show off. It also now had more exhausts and a 3-litre capacity for its flat 6 engine. This would later get bigger, expanding to 3.3 litres in 1978 to give the 911 a nice round 300 horsepower. The 911 now wasn't just a pretty dainty little sports car. It had the overtaking power to match its more butch looks. There were downsides. This was the early days of turbocharging, far from the ubiquity we know today. A significant amount of lag had to be factored into every acceleration before a huge spike of power when everything was up to speed. That went some way to forming the 911's widowmaker reputation of the mid to late 20th century. But if you learned to control it, the rewards were obvious. The G-Series 911 launched the 2.7 RS, the SC and the Carrera, but for us, it was the seismic change of the turbo that makes a place on this list. 85% of the parts on the Porsche 964 were brand new, but somehow it managed to look almost identical to the car that had gone before. But far from being a bit of a nudge forward to keep the 911 current, the basic 964 was actually a lot more revolutionary than it first seemed. In the end, it introduced a whole raft of features that remain on the 911 to this day. At the rear, you found a spoiler that automatically raised itself above a certain speed, and perhaps more importantly, the Carrera 4 introduced a new four-wheel drive system for the first time. And this wasn't just some agricultural four-wheel drive system slapped into a road car. No, it was electronically controlled and split torque 31% to the front and 69% to the rear. That meant you could still feel like you were driving a rear-engined, rear-wheel drive Porsche 911, but you had a little more security, and definitely much, much better handling in the wet. The 964 generation car also jettisoned the old torsion bar suspension for a much more modern coil and damper setup. It still had a flat six, of course, but we're now at 3.6 litres, getting close to the sizes we'd see today, and 250 horsepower as standard. The Carrera 4 was the first 964 to be launched and would hit 62 in 5.5 seconds and slide on to 163 miles an hour. Perhaps because it was so mechanically different, the 964 struggled to become a classic for a while, but as time goes by, the Carrera 4 really comes into focus as one of the greats. The standard 993 911 has become one of the favourites of many over the years since its launch. A decent chunk of that love comes down to the fact that it was the last air-cooled 911 to be built. But when they launched the 993, they weren't exactly to have known that. Back then, its mix of classic looks, air-cooled engine, and some modern technology like twin turbocharging and multi-link suspension made it a classic, and finally seemed to be taming the 911's more wayward handling characteristics. But Porsche still wanted to go racing with the 993, and for that they needed a more extreme version. So out went the four-wheel drive system, which was banned in GT racing anyway. In came more power and bigger turbos, much bigger bodywork including flared arches and a very fancy rear wing, and bingo! You not only had a car ready to compete in GT2 racing, but the ultimate 911. It was sold as the GT, and only 57 were ever built, although more would follow with a full GT2 nameplate. The engine was still 3.6 litres, but with more aggressive turbocharging, the GT now had 430 horsepower, and the removal of the all-wheel drive system and a few more unnecessary trinkets like, airbags, central locking, electric windows, or the sunroof, meant that it was 205 kilograms lighter than a standard 993. The GT also had an aluminium bonnet and doors, had no rear seats, and used thinner glass, all contributing to the weight loss. Also dropping was the 0-62 time, now just 4.4 seconds, while the top speed went the other way, stretching the 911's legs out to 184 miles an hour. There were other toys too, like adjustable front and rear anti-roll bars, and lightweight wheels with magnesium centers. Together, they made the blueprints that all future top-spec 911s would follow. There was an awful lot to get Porsche 911 enthusiasts agitated when the 996 generation car was launched. It was unspeakably water-cooled. And those fried egg headlights, people were dischuffed at best, downright angry at worst. But there was an ace already up the 996's sleeve. A range-topping, model-defining car with a GT badge on it. Not this time a GT2, but another click round the calculator. The 996 GT3 was here to leave a mark. It was launched at the Geneva Motor Show in 1999, ready to be a modern-day reinterpretation of the classic Carrera RS. And, just like that 1973 legend, the 911 GT3 was also meant to homologate the 911 back for racing competition. Outside, it got a meaty bumper and some overblown sills, although the arches refused to flare out significantly, and at the rear, an elegantly sculpted wing appeared. The engine came from a 996 turbo and in part from the 911 GT1 race car, and gave the GT3 360 horsepower while losing the turbo's inevitable lag by, removing the turbos. The engine was a masterpiece. At the time, it was the most powerful, naturally aspirated 911 ever sold, and it was then mated to the 6-speed manual from the 993 GT. New suspension, adjustable dampers, and new anti-roll bars meant the chassis matched the engine. 4.5 seconds to 62 might be slower than the GT2, but the GT3 could do 190 miles an hour. And those figures do not do justice to just how the GT3 delivered that power. You could even upgrade to ceramic brakes and a half cage if you really wanted. If you're looking for absolute out-and-out track day pace, then a GT badge 911 will always be the thing to go for. But there is a very strong argument to be made that the 997-era GTS might be the finest road car that Porsche has ever slapped together. Why? Well, It had the looks of the 997, but more of the analog driving feel the 996 had delivered. A perfect balance of the two, some said. And it was in some ways a bit of an accident that it was so good. The GTS was a run-out model of sorts, a plundering of the 997 parts bin to end the model's life. But that plundering was done in a very considered Porsche way. What you got was the wide body of the turbo and its extended rear track. A 410 horsepower 3.8 litre version of the flat-six engine from the Sport Classic, a set of wheels from the GT3, a revised front spoiler came from the accessories catalogue, and the sport seats and active suspension management were options on most 911s. In fact, there was only a couple of things that were made for the GTS, and those were its damper settings and a little bit of suede. The whole was better than the sum of its parts. With a 4.6 second 0 to 62 mph sprint, one of the best soundtracks that a 911 has ever had, and a top speed of 190 miles an hour, it was instantly a classic. Add in the mechanical limited slip diff, as you could, and it was also one of the best handling cars that Porsche had made for ages. The GTS was basically as fun to drive as the GT3, but didn't constantly try to extract a toll from your spine or remove your eardrums. It might have been perfect. In 2016, Porsche launched a limited run car called the 911R. It was, to many, a GT3 model, but without the showy offy bits like the rear wing, and with a manual gearbox. The fact that there was a limited run left many people a little bit disappointed, but still more than willing to part with some cash to get their hands on such a machine. So, not long after, a very savvy Porsche relented, swiping the wing from the 991.2 era GT3 and fitting a 6-speed manual gearbox, and it sold the first 911 Touring. This was the 911 for the purists. It still had a wing of sorts, but rather than the big one that hung on the back of the GT3, the Touring got a normal extending one from the Carrera GTS. At the back, a flat 6 still sat, now at 4 litre capacity, and able to provide 500 horsepower, over double that of the 911R which we began the video with. You still got everything else the GT3 offered you, with aggressive bumpers, centre-lock wheels, and a 40mm wider track than the standard 911, but with the manual gearbox you could feel closer to the action, and without the big rear wing, you didn't have to be spotted at all times if you didn't really want to. So effective was the 901.2 GT3 that even with the cogs being swapped manually, it could hit 62 miles an hour in just 3.2 seconds, meaning you barely lost out on anything. It still revved to 9,000 RPM. It still got to 196 miles an hour and it would still stick to the road like a limpet. You just felt slightly less like a failed racing driver when driving it through town. And if a wolf in sheep's clothing is what you're looking for, then we shall look no further than the 992 generation ST. Consider this Porsche's 60th birthday present to the 911. Perhaps the ultimate in sort of stealth sports cars. Much like the Touring, it's got more than a little stuff from the current 911 GT3. Add the engine from the GT3 RS and package them in with a manual gearbox. It does without the GT3's rear wheel steering, adds carbon fibre wings, doors, bonnet and roof, has a lightweight clutch and a single mass flywheel, and so it comes in 38 kilograms lighter than a GT3 in its lightest possible touring spec. But it's not designed to be a track monster. With a softer setup and manual gearbox, the ST is a car for the road, a seriously quick car for the road. And then it gets some cracking wheels and returns big Porsche decals to a non-GT3 car. And with some of the GT3 Touring's best styling details, it looks fantastic. Those then are our pick of the greatest Porsche 911s from each era. But what did we miss out, or which one would you have chosen? Let us know in the comments below, and if you did enjoy this video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you see everything we're doing at Goodwood Road and Racing.